She was 6 years old, covered in dirt and trembling as she bypassed the most dangerous men in Chicago. Bursting into the VIP room, she locked eyes with Sebastian Rossi, the city's most ruthless crime boss, and screamed, "They're beating my mama." What Sebastian did next changed absolutely everything. The rain in Chicago that October evening felt like a warning. Inside the private dining room of the Obsidian, a high-end steakhouse that served as the unspoken headquarters of the Rossi Syndicate, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and quiet power. Sebastian Rossi sat at the head of a long mahogany table. At 34, he possessed a chilling kind of authority. He wasn't a loud, boisterous mobster. He was a phantom, a man who spoke softly and let the devastating consequences of his words do the screaming. Sebastian was currently reviewing shipping ledgers from the ports on Lake Michigan. His right-hand man, Silvio Russo, stood by the heavy oak double doors, keeping a watchful eye on the perimeter. It was supposed to be a quiet night, a Tuesday. No rival families, no feds poking around. Just numbers, espresso, and the low hum of jazz playing through the ceiling speakers. Then, the screaming started. It wasn't a grown man's shout of defiance or the crack of gunfire. It was high-pitched, desperate, and entirely out of place. It was the sound of a child. Sebastian didn't look up from his papers immediately, but his pen stopped moving. Outside the heavy oak doors, there was a scuffle, the sound of heavy footsteps, a muffled curse from one of the heavily armed guards stationed in the hallway. And then, the heavy doors burst open. Silvio reached for his holster instantly, his face a mask of lethal intent. But the intruder wasn't an assassin. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6. She wore a faded pink raincoat that was much too big for her, soaked through and stained with dark city mud. Her knees were scraped, bleeding slightly through her ripped leggings, and her dark, curly hair was plastered to her tear-streaked face. Behind her, 2 massive men in tailored suits, men who had literally disposed of bodies for the Rossi family, looked utterly bewildered, holding their hands up in a placating manner. "Boss, I'm sorry," one of the guards stammered, looking terrified. "She just slipped right under us. We didn't want to hurt her." Sebastian finally looked up. His dark eyes, usually completely devoid of warmth, locked onto the tiny, trembling figure. The room was dead silent. The men around the table held their breath. Sebastian Rossi was not known for his patience, and his temper, though rarely seen, was a legendary and fatal thing. The little girl didn't cower. Despite the terrifying men in suits, despite the heavy scent of danger in the room, she marched right up to the edge of the mahogany table, pointing a tiny, trembling finger back toward the street. "They're beating my mama," she screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. "You have to help. Please, the bad men are hurting my mama." Silvio took a step forward, his voice gruff but surprisingly gentle. "Hey kid, you can't be in here. Let's go find the police." Sebastian raised a single finger. The entire room froze. Silvio stopped mid-step. Sebastian slowly pushed his chair back. The leather squeaked in the quiet room. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He was a tall, imposing figure, towering over the child, yet he crouched down so he was eye level with her. Up close, he could see the pure panic in her hazel eyes. "What is your name, little bird?" Sebastian asked, his voice a low, smooth baritone. Lily, she sobbed, wiping her nose with the back of a filthy sleeve. They pushed her in the alley, behind the bakery. Please. Sebastian had a strict rule. Business was business, but women and children were off limits. It was an old-school code that many in his line of work had forgotten. But for Sebastian, whose own mother had suffered at the hands of a violent, debt-ridden father, before Sebastian was old enough to stop it, it was an absolute law. He didn't know this girl. He didn't know her mother. But the raw desperation in Lily's eyes triggered something deep within the cold fortress of his chest. It was a phantom ache, a memory of his own childhood helplessness. Sebastian stood up to his full height and looked at Silvio. "Get the cars." "No, actually. We walk. It's just behind the bakery on 4th. "Sebastian," Silvio warned softly, stepping closer. "It could be a trap. The Colombians have been pushing our borders." "A 6-year-old decoy, Silvio?" Sebastian asked, his voice dropping a dangerous octave. "We walk." He looked back down at the girl. "Show me, Lily." Lily didn't hesitate. She grabbed the hand of the most feared man in Chicago, her tiny, cold fingers wrapping around his large, calloused knuckles, and pulled him toward the door. The visual was absurd. Sebastian Rossi, dressed in a custom $5,000 suit, being led by a muddy child, followed by 4 heavily armed mobsters into the freezing October rain. As they stepped out of the warm restaurant and into the biting chill of the street, Sebastian felt a strange shift in the air. He didn't know it yet, but that tiny hand pulling him through the rain was dragging him straight toward the one thing he never saw coming. A weakness. The alley behind Boulangerie 4th Street was a dark, narrow strip wedged between 2 towering brick buildings. It reeked of damp cardboard and rotting vegetables. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the grit of the city into the gutters. As Sebastian and his men approached, the sounds of a struggle cut through the noise of the downpour. "I told you, I don't have it. Edward is gone. He left us months ago." It was a woman's voice, frantic, breathless, and filled with pain. "I don't give a damn about Edward, Celine," a man's voice barked back, accompanied by the sickening sound of a heavy slap. "The paper has your name on it too. 30 grand. You think you can just hide in this pathetic little apartment while I take the hit?" Sebastian stopped at the edge of the alley, raising a hand to signal his men to hold back. He let go of Lily's hand and gently pushed her behind Silvio's massive legs. "Keep her right here," he murmured. He stepped into the shadows, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of a flickering street lamp. There were 3 men. 2 were standard muscle, thick-necked and slow-looking, wearing cheap leather jackets. The 3rd man was Frank Sullivan. Sebastian recognized him immediately. Frank was a mid-level loan shark, a bottom feeder who preyed on desperate people in the neighborhood. He wasn't part of Sebastian's family, but he paid a small tax to operate on the fringes of Rossi territory. On the wet asphalt, backed against an overflowing dumpster, was Celine Jenkins. Even battered and soaking wet, there was a striking resilience about her. She wore a faded waitress uniform from a diner down the street. Her lip was split, a thin line of blood mixing with the rainwater on her chin. One of the thugs had her by the hair, forcing her to look up at Frank, who was brandishing a steel pipe. I'll get the money, Celine gasped, her eyes darting toward the street, clearly panicked about her missing daughter. Just, please let me go find my little girl. She ran off. She's out in the dark. You aren't going anywhere until I get collateral, Frank sneered, raising the pipe. Maybe a few broken ribs will help you find Edward faster. Frank, a voice cut through the rain. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the very air in the alley feel heavier. Frank froze. The two thugs whipped their heads around. Sebastian stepped out of the shadows, the dim yellow light catching the sharp, predatory angles of his face. His hands were casually resting in the pockets of his expensive trousers, his tailored jacket open to reveal the subtle bulge of a shoulder holster. Sebastian, Mr. Rossi, Frank stammered, the pipe in his hand suddenly looking very heavy and very stupid. I didn't expect to see you out here. Nasty weather. It is, Sebastian agreed smoothly, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. And yet, here you are, Frank, making a tremendous amount of noise and bleeding on my pavement. This is just business, Mr. Rossi, Frank said, taking a step back. The thug holding Celine's hair immediately let go, raising his hands in a defensive posture. Her deadbeat husband owes me 30 large. I'm just collecting. Celine slumped against the brick wall, coughing, her arms wrapped around her stomach. She looked up at Sebastian, her chest heaving. She didn't know who he was, but she saw the absolute terror in her attacker's eyes. Is that right? Sebastian asked, stopping 3 feet away from Frank. You collect debts by beating mothers in alleys while their 6-year-old daughters run screaming into the streets. Frank swallowed hard, a bead of sweat mixing with the rain on his forehead. The kid just took off. We weren't going to hurt the kid. But you were going to hurt her, Sebastian said, gesturing slightly towards Celine without taking his eyes off Frank. A woman. On my territory. You know the rules, Frank. Mr. Rossi, please. It's 30 grand. Sebastian moved faster than a man his size had any right to. He didn't draw his gun. He simply pulled his right hand from his pocket and delivered a devastating, open-handed strike to Frank's throat. Frank gagged, dropping the pipe as his hands flew to his neck, his face turning purple. Before he could hit the ground, Sebastian grabbed the lapels of Frank's cheap jacket and slammed him backward against the brick wall with a sickening crunch. 30 grand is what I tip my tailor, Sebastian hissed, his face inches from Frank's. The polite, soft-spoken mob boss was gone. The monster underneath had surfaced. You are a parasite, Frank, and I detest parasites making a mess in my backyard. The two thugs made a panicked move, but before they could even take a step, Silvio and 3 of Sebastian's guards swarmed the alley. There was no gunfire, just the brutal, efficient sound of fists hitting bone. Within 10 seconds, both thugs were unconscious on the wet pavement. Sebastian let go of Frank, letting the loan shark slide down the wall, gasping desperately for air, completely neutralized. The alley fell silent again, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Sebastian took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his suit. He turned slowly towards Celine. She was huddled against the dumpster, staring at him with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. She had just watched this man dismantle 3 violent men in seconds with chilling precision. "Mama!" a tiny voice shrieked. Lily broke free from Silvio's gentle grip and sprinted across the wet alley, throwing her arms around Celine's neck. "Lily, oh my God, baby, are you hurt?" Celine sobbed, burying her face in her daughter's wet hair, checking her frantically for injuries. "I told you to hide, baby. Why did you run?" "I got help, Mama," Lily said fiercely, pointing a tiny finger at Sebastian. "I got the big man." Celine finally looked up at Sebastian. He was standing over them, the street lamp casting long shadows across his face. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pristine, white silk handkerchief. He crouched down, just as he had done for Lily in the restaurant, and extended his hand, offering the silk to Celine. "For your lip," Sebastian said, his voice entirely different now. Gentle, almost respectful. Celine hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached out to take the handkerchief. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. Sebastian felt a jolt of something foreign, something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Looking into Celine's wide, frightened eyes, he saw a woman who had been pushed to the edge, a survivor trying to protect her cub. "Thank you," Celine whispered, pressing the silk to her bleeding mouth. I don't know who you are, but thank you. My name is Sebastian Rossi," he replied quietly. He saw the exact moment the name registered in her mind. Celine's breath hitched, her eyes widened, and she instinctively pulled Lily tighter against her chest. Everyone in Chicago knew the name Rossi. She hadn't just been saved by a good Samaritan. She had been rescued by the devil himself. Sebastian saw the fear wash over her, and strangely, it bothered him. He stood up, looking down at the two of them. "Silvio," Sebastian called out without looking back. "Yeah, boss. Get Frank and his trash out of my alley. Make sure Frank understands that if he or anyone else ever approaches Ms. Jenkins again, I won't just break his neck. I'll take his hands." "Understood." Sebastian looked back at Celine, whose eyes were still wide with shock. "Where do you live?" Just up the fire escape," Celine stammered, pointing to the rusted iron stairs above them. "Second floor. But we're fine now. Really, Mr. Rossi, we're fine." Sebastian looked at the rusted, unsafe stairs, then back at her split lip and the shivering child in her arms. "No, you aren't," Sebastian said flatly. "Silvio will wait down here until you're safely inside. Tomorrow morning, a car will come for you. You're going to tell me exactly how much your husband owed, and I am going to fix this." "You don't have to do that," Celine said quickly, panic rising in her chest. Being indebted to Frank was terrible. Being indebted to a mafia boss was a death sentence. "Please, I can't owe you." Sebastian paused, turning his head slightly. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You don't owe me anything, Celine," he said softly. He looked down at the little girl in the pink raincoat. "Your daughter already paid your tab. She's a very persuasive negotiator." With that, Sebastian Rossi turned and walked out of the alley, disappearing into the rainy Chicago night, leaving Celine terrified, confused, and irrevocably tangled in the web of the city's most dangerous man. The morning light filtering through Celine's cracked apartment window felt incredibly harsh. She hadn't slept a wink. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren in the Chicago streets had her bolting upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lily, however, slept soundly, curled into a tight ball, under a faded patchwork quilt. At precisely 8 o'clock, a heavy knock echoed through the tiny, drafty apartment. Celine jumped. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the dresser, a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had, and crept toward the door. Peering through the peephole, she didn't see Frank or his thugs. She saw the broad chest of a man in an immaculate dark suit. "Ms. Jenkins," a deep voice rumbled through the thin wood. It was the man from the alley, the one Sebastian called Silvio. "Mr. Rossi sent a car." Celine closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the door. A part of her wanted to lock the deadbolt and pretend none of this was happening. But you didn't ignore a summons from a man like Sebastian Rossi. 10 minutes later, Celine and a sleepy Lily were sitting in the back of a jet-black SUV that smelled of rich leather and expensive cologne. The tinted windows hid the grimy streets of their neighborhood as they were driven smoothly out of the city. They didn't stop at a warehouse or a dark club. Instead, the SUV glided north, turning onto a private tree-lined driveway in the affluent suburb of Lake Forest. The iron gates parted silently, revealing a sprawling stone estate that looked more like a modern fortress than a home. Silvio escorted them through a grand foyer, lined with marble, and into a massive sunlit office. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Sebastian Rossi. In the daylight, without the shadows of the alley, he was even more striking. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal a lattice of dark, intricate tattoos on his forearms, hinting at a brutal past he kept carefully hidden beneath designer suits. "Sit," Sebastian said, gesturing to the plush leather chairs opposite his desk. His voice was smooth, but it wasn't a request. Celine sat, pulling Lily onto her lap. "Mr. Rossi, I don't want any trouble. I have a little money saved. I can pay Frank back." Sebastian held up a hand, silencing her. He slid a thick manila folder across the desk. "Frank is no longer your concern. He has been dealt with. However, Frank was merely a symptom of a much larger disease." Celine frowned, her hands trembling as she looked at the folder. "What do you mean?" Sebastian leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Your ex-husband, Edward. When was the last time you saw him?" 8 months ago, Celine said, her voice barely a whisper. "He packed a bag while I was at my shift at the diner and just left. I haven't heard from him since." "Edward didn't just walk out on you, Celine," Sebastian said quietly. "He ran. And he didn't just owe Frank $30,000. That was pocket change, a gambling debt he used as a smokescreen. The truth is, Edward stole something very valuable from a man named Declan Gallagher." Celine felt the blood drain from her face. Even working at a local diner, she knew the name Gallagher. The Irish syndicate controlled the South Side ports. They were notoriously violent, lacking the quiet, calculated restraint of the Rossi family. "Stole what?" Celine breathed. "Shipping manifests, proof of a massive gun-running operation that could put Gallagher away for life, along with $2 million in uncut diamonds," Sebastian explained, his face a mask of cold seriousness. Edward thought he could sell the information back to them, or to a rival. Instead, he made himself a target. "My men intercepted chatter this morning. Gallagher's crew tracked Edward's last known associates. They found Frank. And through Frank, they found you." Panic, cold and sharp, seize Celine's chest. "But I don't know anything. I don't have what Edward stole." "Gallagher doesn't care," Sebastian stated flatly. "In his mind, you are leverage. If he takes you and the child, Edward comes out of hiding." "Oh God," Celine choked out, burying her face in Lily's hair. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. "Oh God, what do I do? Where do we go?" Sebastian stood up, walking slowly around the desk until he was standing right in front of her. He crouched down, just as he had in the alley, invading her space, but bringing a strange, grounding heat with him. "You don't go anywhere," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative murmur. "You stay here, on my estate. It is the most heavily guarded compound in Illinois. No one gets through those gates without my permission." Celine looked up, her tear-filled eyes searching his unreadable face. "Why? Why are you doing this? We are nothing to you. I can't pay you for this kind of protection." Sebastian's jaw tightened. He looked at Lily, who was watching him with wide, trusting eyes, completely oblivious to the lethal reality of the conversation. Then his gaze shifted back to Celine. He saw the fierce independence in her, the mother's desperation to protect her child against impossible odds. It was a mirror reflecting a past he had tried to bury. "I have a sister," Sebastian said softly, a rare crack in his armor. "She died when she was not much older than Lily, because someone who should have protected her didn't. I don't do favors, Celine, and I don't take charity cases, but I will not allow a child to be collateral damage in my city. Consider yourselves under my absolute protection. You belong to the Rossi house now." The words sent a shiver down Celine's spine. "You belong to the Rossi house now." It was a shield of impenetrable steel, but it also felt entirely like a gilded cage. She was no longer running from a loan shark. She was tethered to the king of the underworld. For 3 days, Celine and Lily lived in the west wing of the Rossi estate. The sheer opulence of their temporary prison was dizzying. Celine was given a wardrobe of silk and cashmere, while Lily was showered with imported toys by the grim-faced guards who seemed entirely charmed by the little girl. Despite the luxury, Celine felt like a ghost. She paced the length of her massive suite, watching the armed men patrol the sprawling, manicured lawns outside. She rarely saw Sebastian during the day. He was a phantom, locked in his office or vanishing into the city to manage an empire built on blood and shadows. But the evenings were different. On the 4th night, Celine wandered down to the massive industrial kitchen for a glass of water. The estate was eerily quiet. As she rounded the corner, she froze. Sitting at the large marble island was Sebastian. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, looking exhausted. But what stopped Celine in her tracks was the sight next to him. Lily was sitting on the counter, swinging her legs, happily eating a bowl of strawberries, while Sebastian sat beside her, clumsily attempting to braid a piece of a blonde doll's hair. The contrast was jarring. The ruthless mob boss, a man who could end a life with a single nod, carefully trying to weave tiny strands of synthetic hair because a 6-year-old asked him to. "You're pulling it too tight, Dom," Lily giggled, entirely unafraid of him. "I am applying structural integrity, little bird," Sebastian replied, deadpan, not looking up from his painstaking work. "If I don't secure the base, The whole operation falls apart. Celine couldn't help it. A soft laugh escaped her lips. Sebastian's head snapped up. His eyes, usually sharp and guarded, softened fractionally as they landed on Celine. She was wearing one of the silk robes provided for her, her dark hair tumbling loosely over her shoulders. For a second, the air between them thickened, the silence stretching out and humming with an unspoken electric current. "Mama, Dom is fixing Princess Penelope," Lily announced proudly. "I see that," Celine smiled, stepping fully into the kitchen. "I hope she wasn't bothering you, Mr. Rossi." "Sebastian," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. He set the doll down. "And she is never a bother." He gave Lily a gentle tap on the nose. "Time for bed, little bird. The princess requires rest." With a dramatic yawn, Lily slid off the counter, hugged Sebastian tightly around his waist, a move that made the hardened criminal visibly stiffen before awkwardly patting her back, and grabbed Celine's hand, letting herself be led back up to the suite. When Celine returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, Sebastian was pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. He pushed one across the marble counter toward her. "Whiskey. You look like you need it," he said. Celine took the heavy crystal glass, the liquid burning a pleasant trail down her throat. She leaned against the counter, looking at the man who had completely derailed her life. "How long do we have to stay here?" she asked softly. Sebastian swirled his drink, staring into the amber depths. "My men are tracking Declan Gallagher. We are squeezing his lieutenants, cutting off his supply lines. It's a delicate operation. If we strike too hard, a war breaks out. But he will break. I just need time." "It's a dangerous world you live in," Celine murmured, setting her glass down. "How do you sleep at night?" Sebastian looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was no defense in his gaze, only a terrifying, magnetic honesty. "I don't. The men I deal with, the things I have done to secure my place, it requires a monster. But I am the monster that keeps the worst monsters at bay." He stepped closer to her, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smelling the intoxicating mix of whiskey, expensive cedar soap, and danger. "I look at you," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "I look at you, and I see a life I was never allowed to have. You shouldn't be here, Celine. You shouldn't be anywhere near my darkness." Celine's breath hitched. She should step away. She knew she should. But she was rooted to the spot, drawn entirely into his orbit. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of a dark tattoo on his forearm. "Maybe I don't want to run from it," she breathed. Sebastian's jaw clenched. He reached up, his large, rough hand cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, his touch impossibly gentle for a man of such violence. He leaned in, the space between them evaporating. Celine closed her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Crash. The romantic tension shattered instantly. A deafening explosion rocked the eastern side of the estate. The heavy oak floors vibrated beneath their feet. The power grid instantly failed, plunging the massive house into pitch blackness. A second later, the backup generators kicked in, bathing the hallways in a jarring, pulsing red emergency light. Sirens began to wail, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the night. Sebastian's demeanor changed in a microsecond. The vulnerable man was gone, replaced entirely by the apex predator of the Chicago underworld. He drew a sleek, matte black Glock from a holster at the small of his back, his eyes scanning the darkness of the hallway. What was that? Celine gasped, absolute terror gripping her throat. A breach, Sebastian snarled. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen burst open, and Silvio ran in, an assault rifle already raised to his shoulder. Boss, it's Gallagher's men. They bypassed the outer perimeter. 2 SUVs crashed the east gate. They're heavily armed, wearing tactical gear. They aren't here to talk. Sebastian's face was a mask of pure, lethal fury. They came for her. They want the leverage. He turned to Celine, grabbing her shoulders tightly. Listen to me. You go upstairs to the suite. There is a panic room behind the bookshelf in my office. The code is 0418. You get Lily. You get inside. And you do not open that door for anyone but me or Silvio. Do you understand? Sebastian, please. Celine sobbed, terrified for her daughter, terrified for the man she was suddenly, inexplicably terrified of losing. Do you understand? He roared, the sheer force of his voice echoing off the marble walls. Yes, she choked out. Go. Celine turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold floors as the terrifying sound of automatic gunfire erupted from the front of the estate. The monster had been unleashed, and the war for her survival had just begun. The estate was a war zone. The deafening staccato of automatic gunfire echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings, shaking the very foundation of the massive Lake Forest compound. Celine sprinted up the sweeping marble staircase, her bare feet slipping slightly on the polished stone. The pulsing red emergency strobes painted the walls in flashes of crimson, turning the opulent home into a terrifying nightmare. She burst into the West Wing suite. Lily was sitting bolt upright in the center of the massive bed, clutching Princess Penelope against her chest, her large hazel eyes wide with silent terror. Mama, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm here, baby, Celine gasped, scooping the little girl into her arms. She didn't have time to be gentle. Survival was measured in seconds. We're going to play a hiding game, okay? A super secret hiding game with Dom. Lily buried her face in Celine's neck, nodding against her collarbone. Celine carried her back out into the chaotic hallway, pressing herself against the cold plaster wall as she made her way toward Sebastian's private study. The heavy oak doors were ajar. She slipped inside, the darkness of the room absolute, save for the red flashes filtering through the large floor-to-ceiling windows. She rushed toward the massive mahogany bookshelf lining the far wall. 0418. Sebastian's code echoed in her mind. Her trembling fingers reached for the spine of the faux encyclopedia that concealed the keypad. Don't touch that, Celine. The voice came from the shadows near the balcony doors. It wasn't the deep, commanding rumble of Sebastian Rossi. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 8 months, a voice that made her stomach violently churn. Celine spun around, clutching Lily tighter. Stepping out from behind the heavy velvet drapes was Edward. He looked terrible, gaunt, drenched in rain, and jittery, his eyes darting frantically around the room. But it was the cheap silver revolver shaking in his hand that made Celine's blood run cold. Edward, Celine breathed. entirely paralyzed by the betrayal standing in front of her. "What are you doing here? How did you get in?" "Gallagher's men brought me," Edward stammered, wiping a hand across his sweaty forehead. "They used a battering ram on the east gate. It's a bloodbath out there, Celine. Rossi's men are holding them off, but Declan gave me one chance. He said, if I bring you and the kid out through the back gardens, my debt is wiped clean. He just wants leverage on Rossi." Celine felt a profound, sickening wave of disgust wash over her. The fear was suddenly replaced by a maternal fury so intense it burned her throat. "You brought an Irish hit squad to where your daughter is sleeping. You're trading us for your own pathetic life." "I don't have a choice," Edward hissed, taking a step forward and raising the gun. "I stole 2 million in uncut diamonds, Celine. I hid them in a lockbox down in Gary, Indiana. I just need time to get them. If I hand you over, Gallagher lets me go get the stones. It's just business, Celine. They won't hurt you. They just want Rossi." "You are a coward," Celine spat, stepping backward, shielding Lily with her own body. "I would rather die than let you take her." "Don't make me do this," Edward whined, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before he could take another step, the thick glass of the study's French doors shattered inward in a shower of deadly crystal. Sebastian Rossi stepped through the broken frame like a demon summoned from the storm. The wind and rain whipped his dark hair around his face. There was a bloody graze across his left cheek, and his bespoke shirt was torn at the shoulder. But his posture was absolute, terrifying perfection. In his right hand was his matte black Glock 19. Edward spun around with a shriek of panic, aiming his trembling revolver at the mob boss. "Drop it, Rossi. I'll shoot. I swear to God I'll shoot." Sebastian didn't flinch. He didn't yell. The sheer, suffocating aura of his authority filled the room, dropping the temperature by 10 degrees. He looked at Edward not as a man, but as a nuisance, a fly buzzing in a room that was about to be swatted. "You brought a cheap 38 caliber revolver to a war, Edward," Sebastian said, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone that cut perfectly through the sound of the storm outside. "And you pointed it at what belongs to me." "She's my wife," Edward screamed. "She was your victim," Sebastian corrected coldly. "Now, she is under the protection of the Rossi family." Edward made a desperate, panicked noise in his throat and tightened his grip on the gun, shifting his aim blindly back toward Celine. He never even had the chance to blink. Sebastian's arm snapped up with blinding speed. Crack. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Edward screamed, the silver revolver clattering to the hardwood floor as his right kneecap shattered completely. He collapsed in a pathetic, writhing heap, clutching his ruined leg and sobbing hysterically. A second later, Silvio rushed into the room, assault rifle raised, 2 other heavily armed Rossi guards flanking him. "Status," Sebastian demanded, not taking his eyes off the sobbing man on the floor. "Perimeter secured, boss," Silvio reported, breathing heavily. "Gallagher lost 8 men. The rest retreated. Cook County Dispatch is in our pocket. They're holding the police response for another 20 minutes so we can clean up the lawn." "Good," Sebastian said smoothly. He gestured to Edward with the barrel of his Glock. "Take this piece of trash to the soundproof basement. Have the medic patch his knee just enough to keep him awake. He is going to give you the exact coordinates of a lockbox in Gary, Indiana. Once we have the diamonds, drive him to the border. If he ever steps foot in Illinois again, take his head." With pleasure, Silvio grimaced, grabbing Edward by the collar and dragging the sobbing man out of the study. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, and suddenly the room was quiet. The gunfire outside had ceased. Only the sound of the rain lashing against the broken window remained. Sebastian slowly engaged the safety of his weapon and placed it on his mahogany desk. The terrifying, ruthless Mafia Don vanished, and the man underneath returned. He turned toward Celine, his chest heaving slightly, his dark eyes searching hers for the fear he was so accustomed to seeing. But Celine wasn't afraid. She set Lily down. The little girl, tears streaming down her face, didn't run to her mother. Instead, she ran straight across the room, wrapping her tiny arms around Sebastian's long legs. "You fixed it, Dom," Lily sobbed into his trousers. "You chased the bad men away." Sebastian froze, staring down at the little girl. Slowly, he dropped to his knees, disregarding the broken glass on the floor, and carefully wrapped his large, heavily tattooed arms around her small frame. Celine walked toward them, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it threatened to break her ribs. She knelt beside them, reaching out to gently touch the bloody graze on Sebastian's cheek. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. "It's over," Sebastian whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. He opened his eyes, looking deeply into Celine's. "Gallagher will be neutralized by morning. The debt is paid. You're free, Celine. You can go anywhere you want." Celine smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up the dark, bullet-riddled room. She shifted closer, resting her forehead against his. "We aren't going anywhere, Sebastian," she murmured softly, her hand sliding to rest over his racing heart. "We're exactly where we belong." The monster of Chicago had finally found his humanity, and in the heart of the underworld, a family was forged in fire, bound by a love far more dangerous and far more powerful than any syndicate in the city. Did you expect that explosive twist with Edward's ultimate betrayal? Sebastian proved that real strength isn't just about ruthlessness, it's about who you are willing to risk everything to protect. If Celine and Sebastian's fierce, protective love story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share your favorite jaw-dropping moment in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more intense, dramatic romance stories.